All right, welcome everybody. My name is Brady Buckner. I am the president of the Financial Services Innovation Coalition, or FSIC. I want to introduce our moderator today, but first, the FSIC is a research organization that takes research on economic issues related to disadvantaged communities. And we turn those solutions into programs in those communities to try to help people out directly. And then we advocate for them at the local level and at the federal level. So with that, I'd like to introduce Kevin Kimball. He is our founder and also our CEO. And Kevin is going to lead today's discussion. Kevin, take it away.
Thanks, Brady. Thanks all you guys for attending this panel. This is a real treat for me. I was saying to people before we got started recording that between Ann and Neil, who are going to be our main speakers today, can't find two people who know more about this topic. And as much as technology can be sort of a bugaboo for a lot of people, it's the future, and it's where we as African Americans and underserved people need to focus a lot of our energies. So like Brady said, I am Kevin Kimball. I am the CEO and founder of FSIC, and we are an economic empowerment platform. We focus a lot on issues from healthcare to finance to housing as it relates to underserved communities, and we do our best to bring information and technology and solutions to those problems. So we have workforce programs, we have financial literacy programs, we have small business empowerment and inclusion programs. So we do run the gambit of these things for people. And so it's always really a pleasure for us to be able to work with people around the country. Neil's in California, Ann's in New York. So from New York to California, we cover the gambit, and this is a real exciting opportunity. So I'm not gonna take a lot of time to do background. I'm gonna let each of them introduce themselves, because really I could do the whole hour talking about their backgrounds and we never get to talk. So hopefully they've come up with a short, pithy elevator speech about who they are. And if they leave anything out that I think is important, I'll fill it in. But the title for today's event is, can we train AI to result in more equitable outcomes for minorities? That's the topic question. Again, both of our speakers today are awesome. And so Ann, I'm gonna let you take off. Go ahead and start.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Ann Griffin. I come from, I'll say the tech industry. So I'm not an academia person, but I lean heavily on academia in terms of their research and like leadership in terms of, there's just a lot out there in terms of ethics, inclusion around AI and blockchain. And I'm the chief product coach and officer at my business, Griffin Product and Growth, as well as chief product and curriculum officer at Tech 2025. I'll say I have a lot of things I'm involved in, so I won't list them all for you here. But as Kevin mentioned, I'm also in the AI space, especially in the space of helping people who are also in industry and actually applying things, connect the dots and figure out how do we, build ethical AI, and like how do we build AI that is also inclusive? Because I feel like there's, we have all these conversations about like, oh, like it's this or it's that, and it's hurting these people, but these are either like after the fact in terms of Bloomberg, exposing something that Amazon did, or it's a research paper. But I found there weren't enough people who were learning and researching that were actually in the industry. And so one of the things I do is also help people in the industry figure out like, how do we apply this? Because as someone who, knows agile and, different types of methodologies, design thinking, like how do we integrate this in there? Because people will say design thinking, right? Like you have to think about this from the perspective of the person who's going to use the product. And a lot of the times, the same people keep getting left out of this design thinking process, right? And other industry I've also involved in is blockchain. I've worked at a legal tech startup in the blockchain space, was part of like a blockchain incubator accelerator in the Ethereum space, and also do quite a bit of talks related to blockchain applications and a bit about crypto as well.
Awesome. Okay, well, Neil, go ahead.
Thanks, Kevin. Hey, everybody. My name is Neil Sahota. So I was actually part of the original IBM Watson team back in the day, which feels like ancient history now, but helped kind of start this whole AI wave we're currently in. Very big believer around building out ecosystems that serve everybody, and very big about social good and social impact. So I actually serve as the United Nations AI advisor and actually help them start the AI for Good initiative. We're using AI and other emerging technology for the Sustainable Development Goals, which are 17 goals for a better world. One of them actually being diversity and inclusion. So I'm always looking for opportunities to help organizations and people essentially help themselves achieve these, I don't call them lofty goals, I call them very important goals that we all need to do and help encourage that mindset towards social enterprise, as well as really champion the cause of diversity and inclusion, because we need diverse perspectives when we actually teach the machines, teach the AI systems. Otherwise, we're going to get things like the Google hate speech detector that was racist, or the Amazon recruiting tool that was sexist. And I'm also really happy to say that, very near to my heart, diversity helps everybody. We know it adds more value. It's not even an argument anymore. It's been benchmarked. So anything we can do to improve that, top to down, very key. AI is a tool, technology is a tool, help us do that, but it's on us as people to actually make it happen.
So, again, these guys did a really good job of cutting their bios down, because honestly, we could have taught, Neil wrote IBM Watts, part of that team. He created automated chess, computerized chess. So, and were you the one who did the, when they were on Jeopardy, did you do the IBM Watson when he was on, when he played Jeopardy? Were you part of that?
That was the first foray, is the Jeopardy challenge.
Yeah, so anyways, I won't go there. So I'm going to get started here. I'm kind of giddy. So this is really cool for me. So you guys have to forgive me if I start talking fast, get excited, but I love this stuff. So first, Brady, can you put up that quote for me? I want Ann and Neil, I want you to look at this quote. And this is
I'll share the screen right now. Hold on a second.
Share the screen. And I'll read it, but you guys can also read it. I'll read it out loud. Okay, so this is from a paper on credit and financial services and AI. So decisions drawing on credit data reproduce and spread existing racial inequality, making it harder to achieve true economic equity. Okay, you can take it off now, Brady. So I want to start with that question, guys, because it seems to me, the computer, like I said, the programmers matter, but the incoming data is so important. So, Ann, just to start with the credit system, because we're doing a paper on housing and AI, and this came up. How do you guard against the underlying racist data that the AI has to deal with?
Yeah, so I think this is a two-part question. I'm sure Neil will also have a lot to say here, right? So we're just talking about like data in general. There's some data that you could take that, that there's certain things that you can do to identify like certain patterns, like clean it, not just like the traditional things of clean data and removing like weird things, but also finding like, we understand here are the things that we would see amongst like, different like, income groups, different like racial disparities, those kind of things. But the thing is the credit score system itself, that type of data is one of those things where I'm like, I don't know if there's really a way, the system is set up in a way that is kind of historically, the whole system is kind of racist. So it's like using that specific type of data, maybe something where it's like, is it that you have to remove it and find like less harmful proxies? Is it that you like still try to use it, but you weight it differently, and find a bunch of other things? So I think it can vary, but that type of thing, right? The system definitely favors, people from different backgrounds, and especially when you consider, when people's credit starts, and if some people's first credit card is like when they're in college and they're broke and they don't have a way to pay it off and that kind of thing, like that's going to impact their credit, like their credit utilization, and like, I'm like, if somebody has like a really low credit limit, despite even if they're paying off every month, I'm like, that's going to, if they're utilizing most of it, like there's certain things where I'm like, you can't really control the rules. And it's somewhat related to, and I know you and I have talked about this in the past, where it's kind of like how the banks technically aren't supposed to be using like zip code, to like assess the price of your house, even though they find ways to kind of do that anyways. But because zip code is known as a very good proxy for like race and socioeconomic status. So it also becomes a question of, when you're designing these things from the front, do you decide, okay, historically this has been used, and maybe to do this, like the banks would require me to use this field, but like, how do we find ways around it? Because there are certain things where the racism is like kind of permanently baked in. There's no way to like undo somebody's like
Right.
credit score of 40 years. So
Right. Neil?
I won't pull any punches. All data is biased. I mean, in large part because we're biased. We've done a good job on trying to strip out explicit bias, but then implicit bias still exists in there.
Right.
And that's what's really killing us. And especially when you think about from an AI perspective, the machine only knows what we teach it.
Right.
So if we're not explicitly being biased, there's bias in that data that actually causes these factors.
Yeah.
If I remember right, Experian, I think it's Experian that using some of these machine learning tools has realized one of the best predictors of your creditworthiness are your social media friends. Right?
Right.
Think about that for a second, right? There's things and the associations, but is there any bias in how you associate what your friends do, their jobs, where they live, all these things?
Right.
Probably.
Right.
That definitely is going to influence all these things. So I just hate to say that way. We always like to think that the data and the math and all these things are pristine.
Right.
The math is the math,
Yeah.
but we're still people either manipulating the numbers, or we're still people teaching the machine how to calculate the numbers, and that's where we got to be really cognizant and cautious of.
Well, how do we address that? I mean, so maybe we'll break new ground here. Maybe between you and Ann, we'll have an answer, and we're going to start pushing it. But what do we do? Because you're right. Like there's a piece. Credit score. So there's a whole thing about if you have a good certain credit score, the 750 people who live in neighborhoods with an average 750 credit score don't have crime in their neighborhoods, right? So, but then I'm like, well, that doesn't really mean anything, because in order to have a 750 credit score, you have to have a certain income. And you look up the median income for someone with a 700 credit score is like 400% of the median income of the country. Median income of the country is like 48,000 a year. So 4 times that is like $170,000, $180,000. So yeah, if you live in a neighborhood with $180,000 median income, you probably don't have. So any AI that uses those data points is automatically going to be skewed the other way. How do you fix that? How do you unskew that data? Or how do you weight it, to Ann's point, how do you weigh it differently?
It starts with a diverse team, right? You have to have people that are representative of, in this case, we're talking about the United States makes you bring that perspective. Because I hate to say it this way, if you live in a neighborhood where everyone's got a credit score of 700 and you're trying to build a system around credit scores, you're not going to know the problems of someone that has a score in the 600s or the 500s or the 400s. Right. And then we know how credit impacts people differently, that some people are never going to know the pain and anguish of a payday loan. Right. Bring those people to the table to factor those things in.
Yeah.
That's one big thing that needs to be done. It's not a nice to have, it's a must to have. The other is we need to get better at either teaching ourselves or teaching an AI system about implicit bias, so it can actually look for implicit bias.
Right.
We ourselves are not that great at doing that.
Right. And
yeah, I think Neil said most of what I would say, but it is that thing of like, if you still have people in tech that say, well, technology is neutral, and that's the thing is what Neil said earlier is also, it's like all of it is biased. It's just you need to have the diverse team to be able to understand like where it is biased, like, and how do you try to neutralize some of those parts. And it's never going to be perfect, but right now what we have is people building things, and it comes from that attitude of move fast and break things. And it's like, well, if you break someone's life because they get arrested because of surveillance software that's using AI, and like, no one on that team comes from a neighborhood where people were getting like arrested for like pretty much nothing. Other things. Those are things where it's like, if those people don't have a voice, you're not going to know. And back to what we were talking about housing. I was talking to, like a month ago, I was talking to my first cousin removed, it's my dad's cousin. So she's like in her mid 60s. And she was just talking about the town that that my grandmother's from in Louisiana, and where she grew up, and how, like, you know, up until the civil rights movement, like there, you know, you couldn't even get a welding job
Right.
in that town in Louisiana, because they knew that even though welding isn't something that is like, you don't need a PhD to do that,
Yeah.
it was a bridge to the middle class,
Right,
right? And if
right.
you start talking about like even housing, I'm like, you have whole areas because of Jim Crow historically have been low income because they were not even able to get the jobs. So it's not even like you just move out of the hood. Like you literally, like what my grandmother did, was like you literally had to like be part of the Great Migration and like move to the north to
Mhm.
even have access to
Yeah.
those jobs, because you were like legally in the South, like locked out of those things. And we're still getting through those things. But unless you have a diverse team where people have that knowledge and have that history,
Yeah.
you're not going to have people who understand that and care about that.
Right. No. It's so is it just as simple of a solution as making the programmers more sensitive, or is it changing the rules by which, you know, what inputs can be done in AI? Is it a combination? I mean, how do we get over that hurdle? I mean, do we have to go through every AI company and, you know, make sure they have 30% Black and brown workforce? Or, I mean, you know, how do we get to that place?
Yeah. I think there's several things, and Neil might have slightly different answers, not because they're like different, but because he might have also things that he has think of. But there's diversity, but then there's also, you know, how many. So I have an engineering degree.
Hmm.
I never at one point did I ever take like a sociology class. That was not a requirement for me. Like I have certain understandings of the world because of like, you know, my friends, my family, who I'm connected to. But like once you get to a certain like layer, there's certain things that you're not going to be familiar with. And even for me, like I still grew up middle class.
Mhm.
And so there's going to be things I'm going to be even less familiar with. And so there's the level of like, part of this education also, it can't just be like how does that work just from like a technical perspective. It's like, how does this work in the realm of like, how does this impact like, you know, this community that we're a part of. And so I think that is a piece that is missing. And then people have been getting paid like so much money over the last like 20 years to like teach agile and get Scrum certified and like, you know, Six Sigma black belt. And I'm like, people paid money for these processes, which you can't even, if in the real life, you can't even follow these exactly to a T, but nobody has, you know, like nobody is selling like, how do we in these processes build in other processes that also help us analyze that. So it also gets down to our process, because it's something where it doesn't have to be like, this is the separate thing that happens after. This should be something that is like integrated. Like if we're going to say we're going to have like 15-minute stand up every day, I think you can easily say, yeah, you broke up what would have been like several 3-hour-long meetings into like having a daily stand up every day. I'm like,
Right.
These are all things where I'm like, this doesn't have to be this long, arduous process. These are things you can break up and make it a part of your everyday work process.
Neil, I want you to respond to that, but I also want you to throw in, you know, the UN is looking at AI. You got the whole team at the UN working on AI. I mean, how are they approaching this or trying to come up with solutions?
It's a lot of it is building around a mindset, and so it's bringing, I'll call it non-traditional people to the table to actually figure these things out.
Okay.
Most software developers, programmers, right? They're following a design, they're following some specification, and they're looking, I'm building a tool that's gonna have this one use.
Okay.
And so everyone just thinks about that one use. We don't do a good job about looking at other perspectives and say, how could this be used differently?
Right.
We could apply this tool in a different way or misuse the tool.
Right.
You think about like a hammer,
Right.
right? I could use that to put a nail in or take a nail out, but that's all they ever think about. They don't think about, well, somebody might try and use this to smash a spider.
Right.
Might use this to smash someone's skull.
Right.
Right. And so that mindset is what's going to happen. It's going to take time, but that's why we need these diverse teams. And so it's bringing this perspective, this level of thinking into the design, into the programming, you know, even into the requirements is all critical. It's the same thing on the flip side. We talk about now like regulation and policy.
Mhm.
This is not the realm of regulators anymore.
Okay.
right? They don't fully understand everything. We need the regulators working with the technologists, working with the nonprofits, working with the people in the different communities that are, going to be impacted by whatever regulation and policy. It's really, you hear the expression, it takes a village.
Yeah.
That's what we need to start doing across the board when we do all these things.
So Brady, we have a couple of comments in the chat. I have some more questions, but let's see what any questions in the chat, Brady.
Yeah, we have a question from Mr. Burge, and it's, how can small business assist in AI coding / data science and providing solutions with academia? And Mr. Burge, if I didn't say that correctly, you can just, unmute and pipe in if you want. And I'd like to start with Ann on that if I could.
Yeah, this is a really great question. And I'll be like 100% honest.
We would have you here otherwise. Please tell us.
I was gonna say I may not necessarily have like the greatest answer to this off the top of my head. Just gonna be fully transparent because I was like, that's a really great question, and I was like, and I was kind of thinking of it. But one of the things that I've thought of, and it would probably depend on the type of business, is I really think it's like, okay, how can small businesses assist in this? But also it's like the companies that are the troublemakers in some of this, that are perpetuating a lot of this, it's kind of like, how can they help themselves? Like they should really be working with the small businesses, because oftentimes the small businesses are the ones who are really in touch. And what Neil said is like people from different backgrounds, different disciplines. And the thing is like when you look at the businesses out there, right? A lot of these small businesses are the ones that are like filling like a gap, a need, a very practical need in their community or multiple communities. And like they actually have a lot of like on the ground knowledge about how things actually work versus like something where it's like very abstracted when you're like, let's say like at a Facebook.
Right.
And so like, I would love to have a better answer on like what small businesses can be doing. And I think it's like, I'm like, yeah, like, try to pitch yourself to these, but also I don't necessarily know that like, that should just be like a blind, that's ableist language. That would just be like a non-informed answer to be like, just pitch yourself. Because like, number one, I know that a lot of these bigger companies are not necessarily looking for the small businesses for help or looking for people who have practical experience and that subject matter expertise. And number two, like, I'm not sure like that's a thing. So I'll just say like, there are gaps in my own knowledge of like how to bridge that gap, but I do have knowledge more from like, this is something the larger businesses honestly should be taking advantage of that would honestly help them. They should be paying the small businesses for their expertise. But honestly, I think would help them in the long run even be more profitable if they actually understand more about what they're trying to solve.
Yeah. Neil?
I think small businesses actually add a lot of value. I think what we've seen is that they're actually the drivers of real innovation. When it comes to like technology like AI, the big companies keep thinking about automation. You think about like banks. Okay, I'll use AI to automate some of my customer service and do some of the things I'm already doing. Whereas you see the small businesses or the startups coming in like, I'm going to find a different way of doing this.
Yeah.
You think about microloans or improving financial literacy in underserved communities. They're the ones actually tapping into AI to create that education and facilitate people hoping to see where those microloans opportunities actually might be.
Yeah.
And I can tell you my work in building out, these different ecosystems, 70% of them are actually small business because they actually come with these great ideas. And what I found is that local problems have global solutions. And so what a lot of these small companies doing can actually be replicated on a broad-based nature, whether it's like these microloans, it's natural disaster recovery, whether it's upskilling to get jobs. At the UN, we actually started something called the Innovation Factory, which is a global program for social impact entrepreneurs, because that's exactly what we've seen. You look in like Malawi or Ghana or Paraguay, where their economies are really struggling, and it's hard to find a good job. That you got local people on the ground that understand what's happening. They're using some of this technology to create apps and programs that, people in underserved communities can actually access, upskill, and try and get a better job. Well, that problem they're solving exists everywhere on the planet.
Right,
And
right.
so we're giving them a platform for them to actually get the resources, the money and help they need and help them scale that to a global solution. So I think that's the opportunity I see from small businesses to help the community at large. And that's also what's fueling a lot of some of the academic research now, is because the innovation is coming from those businesses.
Brady, any other questions in the chat? Any other questions in the chat?
Yeah, we've got a couple more. Do we have time for now,
Okay,
Kevin?
go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Why don't we do these two and then we'll go on? I know Tammy Boyd is here.
Tammy.
Tammy, thanks for showing up. She's going to talk about some healthcare equity issues with AI. We have from Tracy Copeland, and this is a complex but a good question. Is the focus seems to be on fixing an inherently biased system. If all things were equal, what inputs would be required to make it an equitable system going forward?
Neil, let you start and then we'll hit Ann.
I wish I had a good answer for that one, but I don't. That's the struggle we actually have right now.
Can I also add that it seems that, most systems of evaluation focus on a way of excluding people, as opposed to how can I get you financed, and how can I exclude you from getting financed, instead of how can I get you in school, how can I exclude you from getting in school. It always seems to be the focus on, how can we rid people, and we've accepted that as the norm. And so in all things, we are simply adding to a system that's not fair and equitable from its origin. So in order to address that, it would require an entire paradigm shift to address those social inequities, if you will. And so there would need to be a separate system for white people, separate system for Black people, because it does not take into consideration all people from the very beginning.
And I can just jump in. This is Tammy. I mean, definitely from a healthcare perspective, that's true. So with the pandemic, we saw a fast adoption. I mean, telehealth was always there, but because of the epidemic, there's a faster adoption of it. But you're layering on the telehealth and relaxing the benefits on top of, say, for example, the digital divide. So the very people who were bearing the brunt of the pandemic, many of them do not have access to computers, internet, so that's an example of sort of layering on. You hear a lot of people applauding the technology and telehealth and seeing your doctor, but on the opposite side, you're just layering on an issue that we have not, an existing system that we have not already addressed. So, I mean, probably from a different perspective, Tracy, than you were coming from, but definitely in the healthcare area, that's true. We're, instead of trying to overhaul the entire system, we're layering on to that, and not just for minorities. I mean, the rural community as well.
So Tammy, stay. I'm a follow-up question. It's for all three of y'all, but Tammy, you jumped in. I'll start with you. Because we've talked about this healthcare stuff in the past. It seems like there needs to be a bigger investment in like the data collection at the base. So we're talking about healthcare. Like we need to go in and figure out how people live, like how they're living, and feed that back into a system that then can correctly analyze it. So it's like we need some basic research for all the scientists. Because we've built this thing kind of haphazardly. The financial system certainly was built haphazardly, but all this is sort of a haphazard layering on, as you said. So maybe we need to ask the government or the people who are using AI to invest in the basic research of who the people are that we're trying to work with. So Tim, I'll let you start with that.
Yeah, so definitely agree with that. I mean, even early, and staying within the healthcare sector, early on when the pandemic first happened, you saw members of Congress sending letters to CDC saying, hey, you have to collect the data. You have to, who's dying where, of what underlying causes, because so for a long time, we heard that African Americans, early on could not, contract COVID. Yeah. Then as data began to come out, in fact, yes, they can contract COVID, and they are the ones who were disproportionately dying from COVID. And so that's where you really get to see where the data, if you don't have the data, then you can't really see how to, in an accurate way, apply many of the solutions that we need. But data is always, I mean, at the base. And so for healthcare, yes, I mean, you heard different states, or some states were holding back. For example, Florida was not providing all of their data. So we really couldn't see who actually, where the disease was actually happening, or who was, some of the mortality rates were happening. So I definitely agree that data is important, and we always have to push for that.
Yeah. And
Yeah, so my answer might be more closely related to the previous question. But one of the things Kathy O'Neill wrote in her book, Weapons of Math Destruction, is one of the big issues is that we as, like, I guess not specifically us, but I guess what we're seeing a lot of is people who are trying to build systems with the idea of replacing human decisions. That's not necessarily all AI decisions, but when we're talking about trying to deny people or accept people, because there's also, there are AI systems that also like try to detect like cancer or like heart problems and those kind of things. And in those cases, the data is because, obviously the health inequities and also racism in our healthcare system, right? So like some of that data isn't there to make sure that they're getting that input. But then you have other things, right, that are things where it's like, for example, state of Indiana started using algorithms to determine whether or not like you got to like be on like government assistance. And basically, if you filled out anything wrong on that form, because that form basically went in and they put in all the inputs, anything was wrong or anything just like the system didn't understand, automatically rejected your application. And they used to have a system, I think, where it's like you had one person that you interacted with, and then they basically turned it into like the call centers that you would get for like Comcast, where every time you call them, you get a different person on the phone. So there's not somebody who like knows this thing and you've been on the phone for 5 times and you've been working through this. So it's just somebody who like doesn't know you. It's not personal. And you have this algorithm that just is like rejects you for this assistance because you filled out something wrong. You don't know why. The person on the phone doesn't know why, because they're like, well, the algorithm is this. And the problem is, so often we assume, oh, if there's an algorithm involved, the algorithm is smarter than me. And that's the other problem. And I think it's the systems themselves. It's not about like creating like, okay, we're going to have an algorithm for this group, an algorithm for that group. It's really like, some of it is, I mean, we do have to do things to try to remove the bias, but some of it is also like, until we really address like both the systematic issues outside of AI and algorithms, right? And then also the bias that we're dealing with as we're building these algorithms. Like we also need to think of like, how do we have a system where the people work together, which is what they found with the Compass algorithm, which is basically determining whether people were more likely to recommit a crime, recidivism. And when they just used it on its own, it more likely than not would say like, if you're a Black or brown person, we predict that you are more likely to recommit a crime. And when you actually paired that with an actual human, the outcomes were actually much more realistic, not necessarily realistic, but they were much more like closer to what actually happened. And like the bias was like taken out of that. And that's the thing, is like, because we have not addressed the inequity in the actual systems, even minus technology, and that basically how that is, we're manifesting this in our technology by not building this with that in thought. We're basically building systems that when they run on their own, it's like you get like the worst of all the decisions being made by the algorithms. So there's layers to it.
Neil.
No, I completely agree with Tammy and Ann are saying. I think they're spot on. And I think, just to add another layer to this is part of our challenge is that we don't think about how we do some of these things. We spend a lot of time thinking about the ideas and stuff, but when it comes to how we actually implement it, we don't think about that. And so, the pandemic is a great example. You do a lockdown, okay, we'll move all the schools onto, virtual through Zoom and Canvas, all this stuff. It's like, we don't ever stop to ask the question, well, not just how does that work? Here's the platform, but it's like, what do you need to use Zoom? What do you need to be able to do class online? You need a reliable device. You need at least a smart device, if not a laptop for Zoom. You need high-speed internet, right? And the people that are making these decisions, they don't necessarily suffer from these problems, right? But they don't realize that, you may be serving communities that do, they don't actually have access to this, right? There were so many schools caught by surprise that their students didn't have a device to use to log onto a Zoom
Right.
classroom.
Yeah.
They were literally shocked.
Yeah.
There was a run on laptops for people that could afford them.
Right.
What do you do about the people that didn't? I know that my alma mater, they were actually surprised that when they told everyone you can work from home, how many of their employees did not have a laptop, did not have a desktop.
Really?
Yeah. And so suddenly I give them credit when they realized there was a problem. They started running around the campus trying to figure out where all the laptops are that are just laying around to give them to the employees. But that's the thing, is that when we make a decision, how does that actually ripple through, and how are we actually creating value, or how are we impacting all the communities involved? And I think that's the challenge. And we're living in a time where change happens faster and faster, and we can't afford to react to things anymore. It's too late at that point. We have to get good at being proactive thinkers. So much to like what Tracy was talking about earlier, we have to anticipate what will actually happen and be prepared to either rectify that beforehand or have some contingency plan in place to mitigate the damage.
I want to throw one more to Ann's point about the data being biased. When many years ago, when I first graduated from college, before I went to law school, I graduated early, so I had like 9 months. I worked at Harris County pretrial in Houston, Texas. So my job was, I was a pretrial officer, but I was get people released on their own recognizance before the trial. When we did the orientation, the woman who did the orientation said, our goal here is not to put everyone in jail, but is to get as many people in the system as possible. So the next time we arrest them, we can't put them in jail. So to your point about the bias, this is 1992. So the internal bias towards putting people in jail means any data, any program that uses police data is racially biased to begin. I mean, because the whole thing was set up in a way for minorities or African Americans to fail. So this is a fun one I want to do. And Tammy, you don't have to jump in this. I know financial services is not your big deal, but I want to talk about the stock market. I want to talk about Bitcoin. I want to talk about, how all these things, what happened with the stock market last week or 2 weeks ago with Robinhood, et cetera. What do you guys make of that? And are we making more of it than we should? Is it a people problem, or is it an AI problem, or is it a combination? What do you guys think? Neil, you're already live, so we'll let you go, and then I'll jump to Ann. Neil? Yeah.
Sorry, Kevin, can you say that last part again?
So is this a people problem? Is it an AI problem? Is it a legal problem? Because everyone's throwing it at, people, like there's hearings today on Capitol Hill about this, like, these guys were rogue traders, etc. So what happened, and is AI to blame, or is it AI being utilized poorly or well? What do you think?
It's a combination of all of them,
Mhm.
right? Part of it is the technology, and people are using technology they don't fully understand, or people even create it don't fully understand what could happen. And we've seen this with the flash crashes, right? The rapid trading. There are obviously legal regulatory constraints around capital requirements. There are things that obviously play a role, never anticipated in a situation like this. And there's a people challenge, right? People, they behave in very interesting ways. They get clever about things like that way, for good or bad reasons. But you look at like what happened with the GameStop trading and Robinhood and AMC, no one had anticipated the level of coordination, collaboration, and speed in which these things could be done.
Yeah.
Right. These guys pieced together a few different tools, formed these groups, work together, but because no one had anticipated that would actually happen, look what ended up happening.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It created this wild swing. Wall Street obviously panicked. I'm sure it cost them a bunch of money. At the same time, Robinhood, by the time they realized what was going on, I'm not saying that they were necessarily trying to, force traders like that, but they did have some capital requirements they suddenly didn't have the money for.
Right.
This is why I was saying that anticipating, being proactive about what could happen has become such an important skill set.
Okay. And
my favorite statement about this, about the whole GameStop and everything, was from Twitter. Someone said, people tell to like Black people or low income people, or just basically like people who are not already rich. They're like, if you're really serious about, you know, pulling yourself up, like bootstrapping and all this other stuff, you want to become wealthy, you need to invest. And then it's like, people invest and they're like, not like that. And it's like this thing where it's like, they tell people like, this is the way that you're supposed to retire, right? 401ks and that kind of thing. Like they didn't even exist until what, like the 80s, I think.
Yeah.
And so like the thing is, a lot of people, because you actually have to like used to go in person and there used to be paper involved and and then there wasn't really
you had to have a guy on
you could be someone who did not have a college degree and have a pension. You did not need to invest in the stock market. Now for you to be able to retire in the United States of America, like it is almost a necessity to use the stock market. So it's like, okay, there's this thing that first you're like excited because you're getting everyone in, and then you're like, oh wait, now they're organizing. And it's kind of funny because the reality is that we all know that there are these big hedge funds and that kind of stuff that, you know, do this kind of stuff on their own and make a killing. And it's, you know, because like they do it in a certain way and they have the lawyers and and then they have the connections on Capitol Hill. It's just like, oh wow, the stock market was really weird that day, and then like you forget about it. Never, like it's pretty much never happened. You know, it never happened in terms of what the average person knows. They're just like, yeah, the stock market was really wild that week, and then you just go back to like normal news about the stock market. Whereas this was like, oh, there's a Reddit thread, and what Neil was saying is like, the internet didn't used to be a thing. And so the speed at which this is happening and the lack of control that the people who are used to having control had, that was particularly alarming for them. You know, I think it was alarming for other companies where they're like, wait, we had obviously the hedge fund where they were like, we had all of this here, and they're like, we didn't anticipate that. I'm like, well, that's what happens to people when other people manipulate the system and they put a bunch of money into stuff. Like that's generally, I mean, we look at even some of the bubbles where I'm pretty sure some of those people knew, like in the .com bubble, like those companies, you know, so a lot of them didn't even have a profit, had been around for a minute, and then they're like surprised when there's an economic crisis that they don't last because they weren't making money. So I really think there's a lot that it's everything, but I also think there's a lot that's about people and power and trying to control power. And other thing I'll point out, I agree with Neil's point that like Robinhood is like they had a like somewhat of a like a cash liquidity problem on their side, but also they're about to IPO, right? It's probably in their best interest not to make the people that they're worried about, those people's power, angry. And I'm not saying what they did was I'm not saying that was necessarily the right decision, but in terms of we're looking at motivations and behavioral, you know, behavior, like I think those are the places to look.
Well, I'm gonna take moderator's privilege and say two things about this. One, you know, on all the guys who shorted all these companies, that's the game. You know, if you got outsmarted, then you got outsmarted. I think I'm really annoyed that it's like rich people could never lose money. Of course, it's capitalism. I mean, they intentionally borrowed money to bet on a stock that was going to lose. If someone disagreed, then that's, you know, then they lose $1 billion and walk away. The fact that they cried like babies really annoys me at a certain level. I mean, and then for, you know, and for Red Robinhood to not have enough money to cover, because they were taking the trade, so they took the commissions on the trade, so they had no excuse not to have the money for the trades. You know, you don't have the money, that doesn't make any sense. So anyway, I take privilege on that because that was one of the things that just drove me crazy. But for you, and the next question is on Bitcoin's at $50,000. What the F? I mean, is that right?
Well, here's like a thing. So obviously it's like a newish asset, right? And one of the things is like there's a couple of things where regardless of what anything is, it doesn't matter if it's like a series of coffee mugs or pieces of paper or whatever it is, things really only have value when people decide they have value. There's this really great Planet Money story from around 2011, 2010 from NPR about how Brazil basically made up this imaginary currency to fight their inflation. For those of you not familiar, like Brazil, I mean, their inflation has started again, but like I'll say maybe 20-ish years ago, they had this situation where their inflation was out of control. And if you went to the supermarket and you saw the guy that was like taping the prices on everything, because they had to change the price every day, that's how much inflation changed, you would run ahead of that guy and you would grab the can off the shelf, because then you would pay the previous day's price on the cans of food or whatever. And the thing is that like they tried all these things. They tried to freeze people's assets, which made people really angry. They tried all these things and they were like, here are these 4 economists, you guys get in a room together, figure it out. They created this fake currency. Every day posted the exchange rate for this currency. And then people just kind of like figured out what the exchange rate was. And they were like, cool. And then eventually one day people had so much faith in this new currency. Brazil basically just was like, cool, we're throwing out the old currency and we're going to print money for the new currency. And it actually stopped inflation like dead in its tracks for years in Brazil. And what we're seeing with Bitcoin is like, you have something where it showed up and then you just started having enough people who started believing in it. The thing with Bitcoin is there's actually a finite amount of Bitcoin that can ever be produced. Whereas currency, you can just print it. As long as there's trees, you can print.
Right.
So that's one of the things. And so you have this thing that's finite. You have a lot of people that believe that this thing has value. And especially when people start seeing inflation, they start seeing the things that are going on in places like Texas, and the things that have happened during the 4 years of Trump, and people don't feel safe in the powers that are printing the money. Like they are finding other ways to, spend money, like, put their money in other vehicles. And some people are using this like a stock and that they're trying to use it as an investment. Some people are using this as like, this is a currency. If I have to spend it, I spend it, but I'm not using it to try to sell it off. And then you also have the thing where technically, because Bitcoin is distributed, it's immutable, you can't have one person that controls it all. But there have been a lot of theories that have gone around that said, like, if you have enough, or you trigger certain things to happen and basically make everyone go buy it at once, obviously the price is going to go up. Right. So now that you're starting to see like Tesla and JP Morgan and all these other companies are like, we're going to buy billions of dollars worth of Bitcoin and there's a finite amount. Seeing that press release also drives the price up, right? Which if you already have millions of dollars worth of Bitcoin, that's very beneficial to you. And then other people argue that it's also a way to hedge against like fiat inflation. So there's a lot of layers to it, but I think it's really interesting where like, is it worth that much?
Someone's
Maybe, but at the same time, it's also the kind of thing of like, how do you want to treat it? Do you want to treat it like a currency? Do you want to treat it like an investment? It's still very volatile. It's new relative to like fiat currency. So it's really like, I always say, never put more money into anything than you can afford to lose.
Yeah. Neil?
I find the whole thing fascinating with Tesla and Bitcoin. I think they definitely spiked the price up. But I think as Anna's talking, you're seeing more of the big institutions getting into it. I forgot who it was, but somebody just started an ETF around cryptocurrency.
Yeah, I saw that too.
You know what they say, at the end of the day, something is really only worth what people are willing to pay for it.
Yeah.
Right. 50,000 for a Bitcoin may seem like a crazy price, but it might be right now a fair price.
But is it fragile? I mean, so say it really is. So is it like the house? Is like it is like a bubble, or is it like? When I say is it stable, or like tomorrow if Elon Musk falls off a cliff, does Bitcoin go back to $10?
It's definitely volatile. I'll just point out, while Elon says that Tesla would accept Bitcoin as payments, many of his dealerships says they will actually not accept Bitcoin. So,
okay. Yeah, and it's funny because when I was in the blockchain startup, there was this like, I won't name names, but this fairly large company that wanted to be able to basically create its own token even to sell its services that way. And we kind of explained like, because this is a token, this becomes very problematic in that like, if the price of your token fluctuates, there are either going to be times where either you are going to make less money, which your shareholders aren't going to like, or your customers are going to lose money, or your customers risk lose money and you're going to have to promise them to make it up. And I'm like, which kind of is, and I'm like, now you have to run a currency economy on top of your core business, and your core business is not in finance. Yeah. And so it's one of those things, but people get so excited about it. And it took us like a month to talk them down from this, because they were like, we're going to create this coin and it's going to do all this stuff and we're going to sell all our services. And we're like, you're going to bankrupt yourself.
Trying to support a currency.
Trying to support your own currency. And like, we understand why it's exciting, but like you're really in a place where there's really no reason why you shouldn't be accepting fiat currently. And there's certain people who want to accept cryptocurrency, and that's great. But the reality is like, you have to be ready for a lot of complexities to make sure that you're not going to bankrupt yourself when those fluctuations happen, or you like basically screw over your customers when those fluctuations happen. And also just going to drop a thing in the chat. I actually wrote, "Are we in a cryptocurrency bubble?" A few years ago before the last crypto crash. So you guys can read that on your own time.
Thank you. No, thank you for that. Listen, guys, it's almost 3:00. So I'll let everyone close out. Tammy, I'll start with, since you came in with healthcare, we'll start with Tammy, then we'll go to Ann, and then Neil, let you guys all close out, because we're, I don't like to take this more than an hour, and we can do this all day because I have like a million more questions. This is always fun for me. So Tammy, are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here.
So go ahead.
No, I can just, say in terms of healthcare, I think it's really important, again, as we discussed, to also include data, to really understand what is happening really at the core in the system now, so we can know how to how to fix it, but not also to be careful not to layer other complexities onto the system. But we really do, I think, for healthcare, data is crucial. It's really important. So look forward to continuing this conversation around it. And as AI and telehealth and telemedicine, it's fast adoption. I don't know if we're going back to the normal. This may be the new normal. And so how do we prepare underserved communities, minority communities, to be able to survive in this type of environment long term?
Thanks, Tammy. Ann?
Yeah. Are we just basically closing out with our final thoughts?
Yeah, just final thoughts. Yeah.
We've gone I feel like we went on such a journey through this, but
I promise you it's going to be a fun ride. It
was a fun ride. I think you all here, learning about this, are definitely putting yourself at an advantage, because we definitely need more people who actually have the on the ground knowledge of these things and are working. I think some of it is us having to fill the gaps of how this works, because just relating to what's going on in Texas is we're seeing that less and less our government is willing or sometimes even able to help us with these big problems. And I think that the problems we're facing here are existential problems, and you don't necessarily have all the answers tomorrow, but you guys starting to think about this and try to figure out how can I be part of the solution is really what is going to save us, because we're not going to get the answers from the government or from Google, and it's going to be people like you, and also people like Tammy and her work, that is really gonna help save us.
Hopefully. Thanks. Neil?
I definitely echo both Tammy and Ann's statements. I appreciate everyone being here and learning some more and trying to see what you can do and opportunities you can create. I think too often people think that we're just drivers, going along for the ride, when we can actually be the drivers and actually chart out the path. And I really encourage everyone to think about what is it that we can do to help, because I don't think some of these organizations are necessarily trying to be evil about things. I think they just often don't recognize there's actually even a problem. And it's our job not to shine the light on it, but help them either figure out a solution or help show them what the solution should be. I think all of us being here today and participating are actually help doing that. And I encourage everyone to keep up the good fight.
Thanks, Neil. And I'm going to close out by saying that thank you all for being here. Thank you guys for speaking. I know you got a lot of things to do. You guys are really busy, but again, I can't think of 3 better people to talk about this stuff and to educate. Our goal is to bring people on, because things happen, people in Texas didn't realize that all those years they were voting for bad utility policy, that one day they might freeze to death because they didn't force their government to do stuff. So it's important that we keep people in the mix. from workforce to security to finance. And so I thank you guys for doing this, and we'll do more. And hopefully one day we'll actually come with some solutions that we can actually push legislatively. So I encourage you guys to think about ideas and send them back to us, because FSIC, we do go on Capitol Hill. And Neil, you've been with us on events on the Hill. We do go to the Hill. We do push policy and legislation where we can. So I encourage everyone to do that.
Hey,
So with that,
Ann has to leave at 3, but can Neil stay for one more question from the audience?
Sure. Okay, go ahead. Neil,
And Ann's got a hard stop. So Ann, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And we'll have you on again soon. Okay.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you.
Okay, my apologies. I just wanted to make sure, because this is an important question. It's one of the fallacies is the avoidance of getting minority business as it relates to bias in the data. So lack of diversity. How can we get on the list to be asked to participate? And this is from Mr. Burge again. So is there a way that we can get more businesses to step up, African-American owned businesses to step up so that their information can be included? Am I asking that correctly?
Right. The issue, a lot of the implicit bias comes from the fact that, we are not participating in the front end of stuff. So now when you're trying to correct the problem, like Ann said, you really find it tough to do. And it's very important that we participate, in the whole process. And how do we do that? I mean, how do you even get asked?
It's a great question. So I'm going to hopefully give 2 paths that are helpful here, because most organizations and most people working on these systems don't think about this. But in the United Nations, we do have a set of guidelines and other things. And through the AI for Good initiative, we kind of act as a matchmaker to try and actually not just encourage, but kind of push some of these companies to engage in minority-owned business, like people of color and women and all that, so that they get that perspective. The other thing is the White House recently just launched a new Office of AI Initiatives. So it's just now getting off the ground, but there's a real big focus on not just like ethical and responsible AI, but also incorporating better diversity in and trying to figure out ways that we can actually make sure proper representation, proper input, proper training from different communities gets factored into these solutions. So definitely reach out to that office and, offer up your services. They definitely need help and connections. And if you have struggles with that, I'm sure Kevin and Brady can help. And I'm happy to try and tap into any channels that I have in there as well to make this happen.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's good.
And William had a question. William, do you just want to go ahead and ask this? It's, what systems do we change for equality? And can you just describe that a little bit more? You're on mute, William.
Okay, I'll get on mute. Well, first of all, thanks for inviting us on. And this is it's very educational. Real quick, you hear a whole lot about system biases and discriminations, in your banking and in your judicial system. So I'm pretty sure there's some data pain that you all address daily, and Kevin hit on a little bit. But at some point, we got to start addressing what can we change right now? What data can we write into the algorithm that would balance some of this bad data, bad foundation?
That unfortunately, there's no easy answer, William. We get better at finding where the problems are, but we don't know how to best solve them. Because there's this contention about what is then the right thing to do. And to give you a very simple example, you think about the justice system, right? We can train AI robot judges. The UN is really keen on that, but we know the data is extremely biased.
Right. Right.
All right. And the thing is, like, there's unfortunately a great example of this in that there was a football player out of Vanderbilt that was accused and convicted of statutory rape. right? He got 10 years of prison time.
Mhm.
And there was another guy in Stanford, a water polo player, same age,
Mhm.
college athlete, got convicted of statutory rape, and he got 6 months of jail time because the judge says he doesn't want to destroy the kid's life.
Right.
But the one big difference between the two is the guy in Vanderbilt was African American and the guy in Stanford was white.
Right.
So the same crime, same age, both student athletes, they did commit the crime, they should get the same time, right? What is the right amount of time to give for that crime? So it's these questions that people are trying to figure out to create this kind of more equity in the system. Then how do we kind of balance this out and say, okay, then someone that gets accused of this crime, what time should they actually get? Regardless of everything else, you get convicted, what should you get? And that's where people are kind of fumbling around at, saying like, is that 5 years? Is that 7 years? And that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg on trying to resolve this problem. We want to fix it. Everybody wants to fix it. It's more of a moral and ethics type of thing, is what are the proper jail time or what are the proper sentences or the proper outcomes to create here to do that. And that's where a lot of disagreement exists right now.
But can I ask them to, I don't know what's the question or not, but what would happen if we just pull out those bias data points such as race and gender and sexism and religion? What would happen then?
The problem is the way the AI systems learn is that it's going to look and say, okay, right, same crime, same, it's going to start, whether we tell it or not, the gender and the age and all these other things is immaterial. It's going to start wondering why there was a difference in the sentencing.
Okay.
It's trying to find out what are the differences between these people. And there are so many cases that there's a very consistent pattern here that the machine, whether we like it or not, is going to learn that.
Okay.
Football players versus water polo players versus Tennessee versus California. Yeah, it starts to.
I hate to say this, there was a study done on what are the factors that influences a judge's ruling the most, right? And the biggest factor is how hungry the judge is. I'm not joking, right? The hungrier they get, the more mean they get. How do you strip that out so the EA doesn't learn that? You know?
The hangry sentences. All right, guys.
I got some ideas, but I'm keeping to myself. I don't want to control.
Thank you, guys. Any more questions, Brady, off the chat?
Nope, that should do it. And
We're at 3:05.
we're good. We're past a little bit past 3. We said we could go longer, but there's no more questions. So Kevin, if you want to wrap it up.
No, I just want to thank everybody again for coming on, for Neil, Ann, and Tammy for answering questions and giving good information. I hope everyone actually got something. I thought we had good questions. So that usually means we've had good information given. Neil, of course, you're the best. We appreciate you, and we love having you around and talking. And we'll do it. We'll do this again. We will eventually. We're going to figure out some suggestions to actually send to that White House office of AI, because we've got to have some suggestions eventually. Brady, thanks.
Thank you.
And everyone, that will conclude our program today. I'm going to stop the